If you walked into a 1950s kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in suburban Ohio, the first thing you'd hear would be the low, steady hum of a brand-new General Electric refrigerator, a sound so novel that families still bragged about it at backyard cookouts. The second thing you'd notice is the light, a certain pale, buttery light filtering through gingham curtains, settling onto a Formica countertop the color of sea foam. And on that countertop, catching that light, jiggling ever so gently with every footstep on the linoleum, would be a tall, translucent tower of lime green gelatin, studded with suspended pineapple, shredded carrot, and, yes, somehow, a halo of cottage cheese. That tower had a name. It was Jello. And in that decade, it was everywhere. It was in the cookbooks. It was in the magazines. It was in the lunchboxes, on the holiday tables, at the church potlucks, in the hospital cafeterias, and inside the gleaming new Frigidaires, humming in kitchens from San Diego to Scranton. If you opened almost any cookbook published between 1949 and 1959, you could flip to a random page and land on gelatin, sometimes sweet, sometimes savory, sometimes wearing a glossy crown of mayonnaise, always, always molded. To understand why, you have to understand the world these kitchens belong to. The 1950s were not simply a decade, they were a mood, a posture, a national exhale after two of the longest-held breaths in American history, the Great Depression and the Second World War. For nearly 20 years, our grandmothers had lived under rationing, shortage, and anxiety. Sugar was counted in coupons. Meat arrived in modest quantities, if it arrived at all. Butter was precious enough to be smuggled. The pantry, for an entire generation of American women, had been a place of calculation rather than creativity. Then, suddenly, it wasn't. The war ended, the factories pivoted, and the country tumbled headlong into the largest and strangest abundance it had ever known. Suburbs blossomed out of cornfields almost overnight. Levittown, New York, broke ground. In 1947 and by 1951 had delivered more than 17,000 nearly identical houses. Families poured out of cramped city apartments into ranch homes with attached garages, picture windows, and, crucially, kitchens designed around a new idol: the electric refrigerator. This is where the Jello story truly begins, even though the product itself is much, much older. Jello was invented in 1897 in the quiet village of Leroy, New York, by a carpenter and cough syrup maker named Pearl Bixby Waite. He and his wife May mixed powdered gelatin with sugar and fruit flavoring, and May gave it the cheerful name that would outlive them both. Pearl, unfortunately, was not much of a salesman. 2 years later, in 1899, he sold the entire Jello recipe, name and all, to a local businessman named Orator Frank Woodward for the princely sum of $450. History does not record whether Pearl ever regretted that sale, but it should have been a regret big enough to swallow a man whole. Woodward founded what eventually became the Genesee Pure Food Company, and then the Jello Company, and then, through a series of mergers, part of General Foods Corporation by 1925. He didn't invent gelatin dessert. What he did, slowly and patiently, was teach America to want it. He papered the country in recipe booklets. He hired door-to-door salesmen to hand housewives little illustrated pamphlets showing delicate pink puddings and amber fruit rings. Some of those booklets, in the 1900s and 1910s, were illustrated by the painter Rose O'Neill, the same artist who created the Kewpie doll, and her cherubic little gelatin-loving figures sold the dessert as something between a pleasure and a blessing. By the 1920s, Jello was already a familiar name. By the 1930s, it was a sponsor of radio comedy. Jack Benny, the dean of American broadcast comedy, began his long association with the brand in 1934, and for the next decade, millions of Americans heard that sing-song spelled-out jingle, Jello, through the crackling speaker of the family radio. That little melody, written by Don Bester, burrowed into the national ear. It was still humming there, quietly, when the 1950s arrived. But here's the twist the history books sometimes skip. Jello was popular before the war. It was iconic after it. The difference between those two states, popular and iconic, was made of cold. Consider this. In 1940, fewer than half of American households owned a mechanical refrigerator. The icebox, that oak-paneled wooden cabinet chilled by a daily delivery of actual dripping blocks of ice, was still standard in millions of homes. And an icebox, for all its charms, was a temperamental host for a dessert that required hours of steady chilling to set properly. By 1950, that number had climbed past 80%. By 1955, it was pushing 90%. In a single decade, the refrigerator went from luxury to birthright. And the moment a reliable cold box became as ordinary as a kitchen sink, a whole universe of cold cookery became not just possible, but fashionable. Jello was waiting. Picture the scene. A young wife in 1952, newly married, newly moved into a Cape Cod, in a development that didn't exist 2 years earlier. She's 23. She grew up eating her mother's wartime pot roasts and Victory Garden vegetables. Now she has a refrigerator taller than she is, a subscription to Ladies' Home Journal, and a copy of the Good Housekeeping Cookbook her aunt gave her at her bridal shower. She opens it. Gelatin recipes spill out like confetti. Perfection salad, ribbon loaf, tomato aspic, molded Waldorf, sunshine salad, jellied chicken mousse. Every one of them an architectural feat. Every one of them cold. The sound of a metal mold being pulled from the fridge, that soft suction thwop as cold air escapes, was one of the defining sounds of mid-century entertaining. So was the gentle slap of a wet dish towel being wrapped around the mold's outside to loosen its grip. So was the held breath, the quick prayer, and then the triumphant plop as the finished creation landed, intact, on a waiting platter lined with crisp iceberg lettuce. Now, here's a question worth pausing on. Why salads? Why did Americans spend an entire decade suspending tuna, olives, celery, shrimp, and, in at least one Betty Crocker recipe, ground ham in quivering towers of savory gelatin? The answer has almost nothing to do with taste, and almost everything to do with meaning. The gelatin mold was a performance, and the stage was the dining room. In the cultural imagination of the 1950s, the home was not merely a place to live. It was a small, bright theater of American success. The lawn was the stage apron. The picture window was the proscenium, and the dinner table, gleaming under an overhead fixture, was center stage. A woman's job, as defined by 1,000 magazine articles and 100 advertising campaigns, was to direct that theater nightly with precision, warmth, and inexhaustible good cheer. She was meant to demonstrate every day that her household had arrived, that it had the leisure, the ingredients, the equipment, and the taste to produce food that looked like a jeweler's display case. Enter the molded salad. Jello was cheap. A box cost about 10 cents in 1950, the equivalent of a little more than $1 today. Canned fruit was cheap. A can of Dole crushed pineapple ran around. 19 cents. A jar of maraschino cherries, maybe a quarter. Canned vegetables were cheap. But the result, when unmolded onto a glass pedestal plate, looked like something from the cover of a Broadway program. It shimmered. It caught the light. It suggested, without saying a word, that the hostess had mastered her domain. The copper ring molds themselves. sold at the Woolworth's 5 and dime, for under $1, became a kind of quiet status object on the open kitchen shelf, hung in graduated sizes like polished trophies from a sport only women played. You have to understand who was writing the rules. The post-war women's magazines were not casual ephemera. They were empires. Ladies' Home Journal, founded back in 1883, had a circulation in the millions by the early 50s. Good Housekeeping, with its famous seal of approval stamped on tested products since 1909, wielded the kind of cultural authority that today belongs to algorithms. McCall's, Better Homes and Gardens, Woman's Day, Family Circle. Stacked on a coffee table, these magazines carried the weight of gospel. And inside them, gelatin recipes bloomed like wildflowers. Every issue, every season. A 4th of July flag, red and blue and white, achieved with layered cherry, berry, and lemon Jello over whipped cream. A Thanksgiving cranberry ring studded with walnuts. A Christmas green wreath of lime Jello ringed with cream cheese holly leaves. And behind those recipes stood a small group of remarkably powerful women. Chief among them was Marjorie Husted, the Minneapolis home economist who, starting in 1924 and for 3 decades afterward, was the actual mind and voice behind Betty Crocker. Betty, of course, did not exist. She was a composite, a friendly fiction invented by the Washburn-Crosby Company, which became General Mills. Husted wrote her radio scripts, shaped her cookbooks, signed her letters. At the peak of her fame in 1945, Betty Crocker was reportedly the second most recognized woman in America, after Eleanor Roosevelt. By the early 1950s, the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, first published in 1950, had become the wedding gift of an entire generation. A red and white checked volume with a spine that cracked comfortably open to the gelatin chapter. Husted understood something profound. She understood that the new American housewife, often college-educated, often smart, often secretly uncertain, needed a voice in her kitchen. A patient voice, a warm voice, a voice that said, "You can do this, and here is precisely how." Betty Crocker became that voice, and Betty loved gelatin. So did her competitors. General Foods, which owned Jello outright, spent enormous sums building an in-house test kitchen in White Plains, New York, where staff home economists in starched white coats developed hundreds upon hundreds of recipes. The company's recipe booklets, printed by the millions and handed out free at grocery stores, functioned like a slow-release instruction manual for the American palate. The 1953 booklet, titled Joys of Jello Alone, went through multiple printings and was still being reissued into the 1960s. Now, pause here because the numbers are telling. By 1950, Americans were buying enough Jello in a single year to fill a reservoir. General Foods sold approximately 250 million boxes annually by mid-decade. Per capita consumption of gelatin dessert peaked in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the average American household kept multiple boxes on hand at any given moment. The bright rectangles of cardboard, red, green, orange, yellow, lined the pantry shelves of 90% of American homes by 1963. Let that number land. 90%. Which brings us to the strange gleaming question at the heart of this story. What did it actually taste like? What did it feel like on the tongue? Because honestly, dear listener, a molded savory salad made with lime Jello, grated cabbage, and canned tuna is not, by most contemporary standards, what you would call delicious. The texture was slick and trembling, sliding against the roof of the mouth before collapsing in a burst of cool sweetness. The flavor was almost always too sweet for whatever savory thing it was carrying, and almost always a little too firm, giving it that faint, rubbery resistance just before the break. The smell, when you leaned close, was a mingled memory of artificial strawberry and refrigerator plastic, with a faint chemical tang from the red dye number 2 that tinted so many desserts of that era. You could hear it being eaten, a soft, wet click against the fork tines, and the sound of a spoon cutting into. A chilled ring made a hushed, almost apologetic squeak. It was not the taste that mattered. It was the look. And the look was everything. The 1950s were the first truly visual decade in American food. Before the war, most home cooking was judged by its aroma, its heartiness, its comfort. After the war, cooking became a branch of interior design. Color mattered. Shape mattered. Contrast mattered. A hostess arranged her table like a florist arranging a bouquet. A lime ring salad placed beside a plate of pink deviled ham sandwiches, beside a cut glass bowl of orange sherbet punch, was the dinner party equivalent of a 3-chord harmony. Everything had to match. Everything had to sing. This was also, not coincidentally, the dawn of color television, the peak of glossy magazine photography, and the early boom years of the color Polaroid. The eye was being trained. Americans were learning to photograph their own lives. And food, served beautifully on the family china, was one of the first subjects. Take a breath here. Think about that for a moment. The housewife of 1955, carefully unmolding a ring of tomato aspic, was not so far in spirit from the Instagrammer of today, carefully angling her iced latte beside a sprig of rosemary. The impulse is the same. The gaze is the same. The hunger to be seen, to say without saying, "My life has beauty in it. My table has abundance on it. My hands made this." That hunger did not arrive with the smartphone. It arrived with the Kodachrome and the Kelvinator. There's a deeper current here, too. Something harder to see from a distance of 70 years. The 1950s were the opening years of the Cold War. The Korean conflict ran from 1950 to 1953. The Rosenberg trial concluded in 1951. The Soviet Union tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1953. Backyard fallout shelters became, for a brief and surreal moment, a standard feature of the American home improvement magazine. Duck and cover drills filled the classroom, and inside that climate of anxious peace, the American kitchen took on a political weight it had never carried before. In 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stood face to face in a model American kitchen at an exhibition in Moscow, arguing about dishwashers and washing machines. It was called the kitchen debate. Nixon's argument, boiled down, was this: our kitchens are better, and therefore our system is better. The automatic coffee pot, the 2-door fridge, the counter-height oven. These, he implied, were the trophies of freedom. In that context, the shining gelatin tower on the dinner table was not just dessert. It was a quiet monument. It said, "We have refrigeration. We have leisure. We have color. We have flavor on demand. We have arrived." Now, here's another pattern worth noticing. Who actually made these dishes? Who stood at that seafoam counter measuring powdered gelatin into a glass bowl and waiting for the kettle to sing? Overwhelmingly, women. And overwhelmingly, white, middle-class, suburban women. This is important to say plainly. The Jello mold culture was a product of a specific America. It lived in the new developments, in the homes built for returning veterans under the GI Bill, in the neighborhoods shaped by post-war prosperity and, it must be acknowledged, by the exclusionary redlining policies that shut many Black and immigrant families out of suburban life. The bright, molded 1950s kitchen was not a universal American experience. It was an image, a powerful image, but a selective one. And yet, Even outside the idealized suburb, Jello found its way. In the church basements of the rural South, a congealed salad appeared at every funeral dinner, set on long folding tables beside the deviled eggs and the sweet tea sweating in aluminum pitchers. In the farm kitchens of the upper Midwest, a lime Jello with cottage cheese became so regionally beloved that in Minnesota and Iowa, it acquired a semi-official nickname, green stuff. In Utah, gelatin consumption climbed to such a peak that Salt Lake City became, briefly and genuinely, the gelatin capital of America, consuming roughly twice the national per capita average by the late 1990s, and the state legislature, in a moment of unlikely whimsy, would later declare Jello the official state snack in 2001 after a grassroots petition famously organized in protest when Des Moines briefly overtook Salt Lake in consumption figures. Our grandmothers carried these recipes with them. They tucked handwritten index cards into wooden boxes. They dog-eared pages in the red plaid Better Homes and Gardens new cookbook of 1953. They passed techniques like folklore. Always dissolve the powder in boiling water first. Always chill until slightly thickened before folding in fruit, or your fruit will sink. Always oil the mold. Always run a thin knife around the edge before unmolding. Listen to the soundtrack of that labor. The kettle's rise and whistle. The clatter of a metal spoon against a Pyrex bowl. The slow, silken pour of hot liquid onto glittering crystals of Jello. And the soft fizz of dissolution. The thud of the refrigerator door. The tick-tick-tick of the Sunbeam kitchen timer. The laughter from a Jack Benny rerun on the television in the next room. These were the small, patient sounds of post-war domestic hope. But nothing lasts forever, and the gelatin empire was no exception. The shift began quietly in the middle of the 1960s and gathered force through the 1970s. Several currents converged. First, a new generation of cooks began rejecting convenience food in favor of what they saw as more honest cuisine. Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking, published in 1961, reintroduced American home cooks to butter, cream, herbs, and slow-simmered sauces. Her television program, The French Chef, premiered in 1963 and made her a household name by mid-decade. Suddenly, a roasted chicken with tarragon felt more sophisticated than a ring of tuna suspended in lemon Jello. Second, the women who had been the audience for the 1950s domestic ideal began, en masse, to reject it. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, put a name to the quiet dissatisfaction that many housewives had felt but never articulated. A whole generation of daughters looked at their mothers' cookbooks and saw not a love language, but a cage. The gelatin mold, glistening on the holiday table, became a symbol of a life they did not want to replicate. Third, the counterculture brought new flavors, new ingredients, and new moral frameworks to the American kitchen. Whole grains, brown rice, yogurt, stir-fried vegetables. The rise of health food culture in the late 1960s and early 1970s made powdered gelatin, artificial color, and canned fruit cocktail feel suddenly, irredeemably square. And fourth, fashion simply moved on. By 1980, the gelatin mold had become shorthand in sitcoms and satire for a dated, embarrassing past. Quivering aspic starred in nostalgic comedy skits. Jello was still sold, still beloved in many homes, but the elaborate architectural savory creations had become, in most kitchens, a memory. Here's the pattern interrupt for this part of the story. That fall was not total. It was not final. Because the instinct behind Jello, the instinct to make food beautiful, to mold it, to photograph it, to serve it as proof of a life well kept, did not die. It migrated. Watch what happened next. In the 1980s and 1990s, the visual food impulse reappeared in glossy coffee table cookbooks and in the rise of celebrity chefs on television. Martha Stewart, more than anyone, picked up the thread our grandmothers had been weaving. Her first book, Entertaining, published in 1982, was in many ways a direct spiritual heir to the Betty Crocker picture cookbook. Same premise, same aesthetic ambition, same insistence that food was a canvas for domestic meaning. The difference was the ingredients. Raspberries instead of canned mandarin oranges, fresh herbs instead of pimento-stuffed olives. But the photographic sensibility, the staged table, the layered color scheme, the implicit promise that a beautiful meal is a beautiful life, all of it was borrowed, consciously or not, from the magazines of the 50s. Then came the internet. Then came the camera phone. Then came Instagram, launched in October 2010. And here is where the story of Jello comes full circle, in a way that ought to make every food historian smile quietly to herself. The Instagram food aesthetic, at its heart, is a revival of the 1950s food aesthetic. Suspended ingredients, striking color contrast, perfect circles and rings, glossy surfaces, a downward gaze, a flattering light, a plate arranged so the eye knows exactly where to land. The ingredients have changed. Acai bowls instead of apricot rings, avocado toast instead of cream cheese stuffed celery, bundt cakes of glistening glazed matcha instead of towers of lime gelatin. But the grammar of the image is the same, and the emotional work it does is exactly the same. To post a beautifully plated dish to a feed of followers is to do what our grandmothers did when they unmolded a perfection salad for the bridge club. To say, look at what I have made. Look at the life I have built. Look at the beauty I have coaxed out of an ordinary Tuesday. The shimmer on a lime Jello ring and the shimmer on a glazed matcha donut are, it turns out, cousins. There is one more thread worth pulling here, and it's a tender one for the millions of Americans alive today who remember the 1950s kitchen, not as a symbol or a trend, but as the actual kitchen of their actual mother. Jello is not ironic. It's love. It's a grandmother's trembling hands pulling a copper ring mold out of the fridge with a damp towel. It's the Christmas dinner at Aunt Florence's house in 1958, when she served a cranberry walnut salad so bright it made the candles on the table look dim. It's the summer afternoon in a Levittown kitchen in 1956, when the lime Jello came out just right and the whole family sat down together. And for one small moment, the centuries-long list of troubles, from the Depression to the war to the bomb, felt very far away. That's the thing about food history. Beneath the data and the ad campaigns and the corporate strategies, there are always kitchens. Real kitchens, real hands, real afternoons of patient work, done in the name of caring for a family. Jello, for all its sugar and color number 40 and industrial gelatin, was carried into millions of homes on the hands of women who loved the people they were feeding. Whatever else you say about the 1950s, you have to say that too. So when you see Jello today, sitting quietly on the shelf of the grocery store, in its familiar little rectangular box, with the strawberry or the orange or the grape on the label, remember what you're looking at. You are looking at a cultural artifact. You are looking at a survivor of the Depression, the war, the refrigerator revolution, the television revolution, the feminist revolution, and the internet revolution. You are looking at a product that once symbolized American prosperity, then American conformity, then American kitsch, and now, quietly, American nostalgia. And the next time you scroll past a perfectly arranged breakfast plate, the berries placed just so, the honey drizzled in a slow, glossy ribbon, think for a moment of the hostess in 1955, standing at her seafoam counter, holding her breath as she lifted the copper ring mold, waiting for that soft suction thwop, that gentle surrender, that quivering finished tower that was going to carry so much meaning onto the dinner table. We never stopped making beautiful food for the eye. We just changed the mold. Which leaves one final question, and it's the one I always love most. Did your grandmother have a signature Jello? Was it ruby red at Christmas, bright green at Easter, studded with walnuts and miniature marshmallows, unmolded with that precise and hopeful little shake? Somewhere in a shoebox of index cards, somewhere in the margin of a cracked spine cookbook, somewhere in the quiet memory of a kitchen long since sold, there is still a recipe in her handwriting. And though the ingredients may seem strange to us now, and the colors too loud, and the whole idea a little absurd, the love baked into those slanting cursive letters is as real as it ever was. That's the quiet inheritance of the 1950s kitchen. Not the gelatin itself, but the gesture behind it. The making of something beautiful, again and again, for the people we love, on ordinary days, under ordinary light, in the small and ordinary hope that somebody will remember. And someone always does.